Okay, so just a bit of an overview of what I'm going to try and cover and talk about today. So just starting by thinking about what do we actually mean by mental health and well-being, what kinds of things are we talking about? And then putting that in context, we are talking about children and young people, so development and developmental stages are the really important context around young people for their mental health and for their well-being, and the two can't be separated. And then I want to focus on three key areas that are foundations of well-being and good mental health. So promoting emotional well-being, supporting positive relationships, and supporting behavioural challenges. And then we'll have a short period of time at the end just to think about when is more support needed. So these are universal strategies that we all need to keep our well-being and our mental health in a good place, but there are times where extra support is going to be needed for your child or the children that you're working with, and we'll just talk a little bit about some of the signs that that might be the case, and again focus on caring for yourself as a parent and caregiver, or as a member of staff, or someone who is working with children. So if we think about what mental health is, this is the World Health Organization's definition of mental health. So a state of mind in which an individual can realise their own abilities, cope with the normal stresses of life, and work or learn, in children's case, productively, and make a contribution to his or her community. So mental health is not just the absence of difficulties. It's also about meeting potential and being able to actually flourish at your own pace and in your own progress. And when we think about well-being, some of you will be very familiar with this. This is our Scottish National Practice Model, Getting It Right for Every Child. So there's a real understanding at a national level that well-being has to be about all areas of life. So family setting, community and society as a whole. So we're thinking about all of these areas independently being important, but also working very much together to give an overall sense of well-being for young people. And we're trying to think about which are the areas that a young person or a child that you're parenting or supporting is really struggling most with, and how are they interacting with each other as well. So, as I said, the context for our young people's well-being is the developmental stages that they're going through. Development is a process that happens over time, so it's about gaining new skills and new capabilities. It's usually a step-by-step process, so skills are acquired and then further skills are built on top of those. But the pace and the progress of emotional and social and behavioural development can be very varied and very diverse depending on the individual child. And within that developmental process, there can be very quick progress for some skills and capabilities, or there can be certain skills and capabilities that stay at the same place for a long period of time, and there isn't a large acquisition of new skill. So every child is going to have areas that are more developed and some that are less developed that they need more support with. And if we want to really support children's well-being, we need to really understand where they are at their individual stage and level. And it's really important that our expectations and the way that we pitch our support for that child is at their pace and fits well with where they are developmentally, because that means that they will then be much more able to meet their potential. So I'm just going to do a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of different stages of development. This isn't in any way a comprehensive list of the development of a young person, but some of the things that happen for our emotional and social development at different stages, to just put in context what we talk about when we're talking about well-being. So for a young person in their early years, it's a time of really rapid development, and we can see that physically, socially, emotionally, in terms of their behaviour and the things that they achieve. And at this stage of development, what young people really need is safety and boundaries from the adults around them. They need routines and predictability. but they also need lots of opportunities to play and explore, and lots of affection and warmth from their caregivers. And this is particularly the case for children with neurodevelopmental conditions. You know, they really need to have that predictability and sense of safety in their lives so that they understand what's expected of them. At this stage of development, moods can change very rapidly, and young people can have very intense feelings, but they might be very short-lived. So they might have a very intense feeling about a particular item that they want or don't want, but then within a couple of minutes, they've moved on from that. The parent or caregiver may not have, but the child has. And it's the relationships that young people have with the safe adults around them that really give them a sense of their confidence in their own abilities and a sense of who they are at this stage of development. And they need those strong and warm connections to be able to express their emotions, and also to start to understand how to regulate and manage those emotions. And just the presence of a caregiver for that developmental stage can be enough to soothe. They're starting to learn some of those skills by being soothed by those around them. Middle childhood, there are some different developmental tasks and processes. So highly active in middle childhood, wanting to explore the world, much greater need for physical activity to regulate, being able to take risks and test out their skills, learn about the world around them, what's expected of them, how they should respond. And there's more of a focus then on interacting with and understanding, or not understanding in some cases, peers and other people out with the family. And this is the stage of development where you may see things like trying out things like telling lies, cheating, stealing, just to see what the rules are, to try and understand what's expected of them. And that's about learning about consequences and social rules and norms. And there's a drive for independence and learning more skills to do things for themselves at this stage as well. Emotionally, there's progress towards describing their experiences and being able to talk about their feelings a little bit more. And adolescence, as I'm sure everyone is aware, is another extremely rapid stage of development with significant times of transition, which can have a big impact on well-being. But also just in terms of those social and emotional and behavioural developmental tasks become quite intense at this stage. Young people are trying to develop a sense of identity and want to express themselves. Their self-esteem is greatly affected by the things that they do and who they spend time with. They want to be more independent and be trusted to make more choices, decisions. They may have lots of thoughts about the future, and that can be a great source of anxiety. You might see an increase in impulsive and risk-taking behaviours at that stage as well. Puberty is a massive factor, and awareness of body changes can be a significant impact. There might be a desire for more privacy at that stage as well. An interest or a confusion around relationships, whether it's peers or romantic relationships. And again, just that progression of learning about problem solving, what's expected of them, what social norms are, and a real sense of justice and fairness and things being as they want them to be. There also could be, and is usually, a real increase in an awareness of diversity and the differences between themselves and peers at this stage as well. So, as I said, that's just a very brief overview of some of the developmental tasks at different ages and stages. And there are different challenges for different young people across those stages. And that can change over time. There are particular points in time that are very challenging for all children and young people. Transition into school, for example, or transition from primary to secondary school. But there are a range of challenges that can happen either at a society community level, within that family or the setting that the young person is in. It could be related to the child's own needs and developmental stage or support needs, or it can be related to your own support needs as a parent or a caregiver. And we know that young people with neurodevelopmental conditions unfortunately do have additional risks and vulnerabilities. And these can be many and varied as well. So it could be at a wider society level where there's adversity. It could be stigma or exclusion. lack of access to meaningful or pleasurable activities, or lack of access to services is a huge issue at the moment as well. So it's a real journey of times of challenge, but maybe also times of progress, and times of development. And the challenges that are faced can really impact differently depending on the developmental stage that your child or young person is at. But we also have protective factors, and protective factors can be preventative, so they can prevent our well-being and our mental health deteriorating. They can also cushion us and buffer the impact of risk factors, and they can interrupt the progress of accumulating risk factors. So it's important to think about what we can do to promote resilience and maintain well-being. So if we think about the first area, which is promoting emotional well-being, I've divided that into 3 different areas. So calming and soothing and relaxation, thinking about our young people's self-esteem and confidence, and also opportunities for fun and activity, playfulness, exploration, are all really key to emotional well-being. So when we're thinking about emotional well-being, quite often we're thinking about, how can we support young people when they're in high states of distress? So whether that's high levels of frustration and anger, or high levels of anxiety, feeling tearful and feeling overwhelmed, how the caregivers and the adults around a child responds to them in that moment of high distress is really key. Because when people are in that emotional state, they're not accessing the thinking part of their brain. The alarm system of their brain is going off, putting them into fight, flight, or freeze, and they're not able to reason or to respond to logical thinking at that stage. And that can be a really overwhelming experience as an observer of that level of distress. So as a parent or as a caregiver, it's very easy to become overwhelmed yourself when you are viewing your children experiencing these really strong or difficult emotions. So it can be really helpful to just take some time to have a think about how you feel in these moments and what that triggers for you, because that will be based on how you feel at the time, any pressures that are going on for you, and your own experiences of being parented and your own childhood. And it's really important to try and notice, am I becoming very distressed as well? And then think about what might help you to soothe yourself in those times. The other thing that we need to think about as well is where that child is developmentally. So what stage is the young person or the child that you're looking after in terms of their emotional expression? How do they let you know how they feel, and how do they regulate that emotion at this stage in their development? So in the very early days, so when we're talking about babies and infants, most of the time the emotional development is about their attention to their caregiver. So they're directing their attention to their caregiver to express their feelings and getting a response back from that caregiver. And that moves on to really relying on the caregiver scaffolding the emotion for them and helping them to ride that emotion through and then soothe or put something in place that will help them to feel better or meet their need. Over early childhood, there starts to be an increased awareness of their own responses, and they can start to reach that stage that you may see at toddler stage, or it could be later in development for a young person whose emotional development is delayed, where they get quite irritable around limits and want to do everything for themselves and get very frustrated with things. And then that progresses on to being able to do a bit of self-talk about their own emotions, or telling others. And that doesn't have to be with verbal language. It could be showing as well, or using picture or visual systems. And then after that, we're thinking about young people progressing to starting to learn their own ways of calming. So maybe not always needing their caregiver to do the calming and the soothing, starting to have small ways of calming themselves. And then being able to maybe take themselves away from situations for some quiet and calm time if they know that they're going to get upset. Moving on to a developmental stage of being able to have multiple different strategies and tools that they can use independently. And then finally being able to actually see the link between different feelings. So feeling angry about being anxious or feeling sad about being anxious. And it may be that, you know, some children and young people take many, many years to get to that level of emotional awareness, and they always need support from other people to understand what strategies help them when they feel strong emotions. So a really important process in early childhood and beyond, if your child continues to need it, is the process of co-regulation. And what that means is the child having the sense, my feelings make sense and they can be managed. So it's a very supportive process between the parent or caregiver and the child. So actually using the calm and regulated nervous system of the adult to calm the nervous system of the child. So the kind of thing that we would do with babies when they cry is pick them up, hold them very close to our own heartbeat, breathe in a slow way, rock them side to side. That's co-regulation, but that can continue and should continue throughout childhood. So it may become different as time goes on, depending on the level of development that your child is at. But what you're trying to do is really put yourself in that child's shoes and give them a reliable response over time to their distress. And that repeated experience of being comforted is what helps children to understand their emotions, put them in context, and to feel safe. So the adult is modelling, this is what we do when we feel distressed, and perhaps even offering specific tools or strategies. And over time, the child is then going to learn ways to comfort themselves. And the length of time that that takes obviously varies a lot, but that's the process of co-regulation helps young people to start to learn how they might be able to comfort themselves or ask for that comfort from others. And the other process is the process of containment. And so, oh, hang on, I've missed a slide. Sorry, I'll go back. So just some examples of co-regulation as development moves on. We want to think about being respectful of that child and others around them, making sure that the activities that we do for co-regulation fit their interests and their sensory needs, as well as their developmental level. So for that very distressed emotional state, we're thinking about activities that are relational, so with a safe adult, so not something that the child's going to be doing independently. If they're repetitive and rhythmic and rewarding and pleasurable, that'll also have a bigger impact on just calming that alarm system in the body in the fight or flight response. So joint activities are really good. So back and forth games, drawing or colouring together, singing together, breathing together, using muscle relaxation strategies together. Movement is also a very good way of co-regulating. So walking, dancing, having a kitchen disco. I know that was quite popular during COVID times. Things like drumming and tapping, pulling and pushing activities, passing a ball back and forth, bouncing on a ball, bouncing on the trampoline together, swinging, all of those kinds of physical movements. But you're trying to match the child as much as you can. So match their volume, match their tone, get on their level. It's activities together to regulate, to model that approach to calming and soothing the body. So the next important process is containment. So that's giving the child the sense I'm safe and I'm understood. So what we're trying to do when children experience really intense emotions is to come into that space with a very calm, containing response. So it's about hearing and listening to the child's distress without becoming overwhelmed yourself, which, as I said before, is not always easy to do because it can be very triggering when you see children experiencing very strong emotions. But you're trying to make sure that you're responding in as calm a way as possible. So calm voice, calm body language, calm posture. We're trying to connect after we've done that initial calming, but in a very minimal way. So using 1 or 2 words, using the child's language as much as possible, or visuals if that's what they use, but just connecting and showing that child that we understand how they feel in that moment and there's a shared understanding. We don't want to overwhelm with language at this stage because that can really escalate the distress. Once the calming and the regulation has happened, we're then thinking about the correction part of it, which is the teaching part of it, which is helping the child to reflect on the situation as is developmentally appropriate for them. So for younger children or children who have difficulties with language or who have delays in their social and emotional understanding, we're thinking about using stories, using pictures, using play, visuals that they have already been able to understand and use. You can use scales, thermometers, colourful cards, anything that will help them to understand this is how I felt, and then someone understands how I felt. And you can take that as far as is possible, depending on the child's own level of ability, and thinking about putting some perspective around why they felt that way and really showing that you understand what they need and problem solving together, but always using the child's words and the child's understanding as the basis, to try and think about what might help the next time this happens. If you have a child or young person who's able to use some of those independent strategies, often they need to be taught very explicitly for young people with neurodevelopmental conditions. So sometimes young people can learn through observing the adults around them and the soothing that they get from the adults around them to develop their own strategies, and they will start to use them naturally. That's not always the case for our young people who have neurodevelopmental conditions. So we might have to be very explicit about when we feel this way, these are the things that help, and we can put together a bit of a toolkit so we can think about relaxation strategies to really calm that physical response. So they might be about breathing exercises, muscle relaxation. They could be activities that regulate breathing, like we spoke about before, co-regulation type activities. Or it may be using particular safe places or sensory items that really soothe the child. You can also put in that toolkit activities that they enjoy that help them to stay regulated. So whether that's building with Lego or drawing or colouring, outdoor play, physical movement, listening to music, singing, using instruments, anything that they find helps them to feel calm and happy. And then we can think as well, if it's appropriate for the young person that you're supporting, about some thinking tools. So distraction can be helpful just to move children on from becoming overwhelmed and move their attention away from difficult thoughts or feelings. That's not the same as not attending to those difficult thoughts or feelings, but just as a temporary strategy to help them to get past something difficult, we can use distraction, and that has to just be catered to the level of the child that you're working with or supporting or parenting. So the other important part of emotional regulation and promoting emotional well-being is just providing plenty of time for fun and activity and playfulness. So it's really important to just think about what would work best in your family or your setting. Are there good times to join in with your child's play or exploration and to have fun together? What are their favourite activities? Is there anything new that you could think of that you could try together? Often just being with children and young people is enough in a completely unconditional way. So just giving them the message that the relationship is really important and it's stronger than anything that goes wrong, and having a light and playful attitude around about them, and just showing your interest and curiosity and allowing them to take the lead. So it doesn't have to be setting up particular games or play activities. It can just be joining them in what they're interested in, and listening to them can be really, really supportive emotionally. And it really helps with what we're going to talk about next, which is thinking about confidence and self-esteem and the importance of that for emotional well-being. So when we're thinking about self-esteem and confidence, we're thinking about helping young people to feel liked and accepted for who they are. So not thinking about changing themselves or fitting in with others. Often children's role models are the adults or their peers around them, but they can also be characters. Sometimes children really identify with characters from stories or from TV programs or from games, and you can really use that interest and that role model as a way to talk to them about their feelings and about what they're like, the things that they're good at, the things that they find harder. And you can also give them very, again, explicit feedback is sometimes more necessary for children with neurodevelopmental conditions, to actually point out to them, that was very kind, you're funny, and using those words and that reinforcement to help them to understand themselves is a really good way of building a sense of self and a self-esteem. Ask questions, showing interest again in what they're doing, noticing what they're doing without judgment. And you can use very explicit positive statements. I'm really grateful for you. Thank you for putting your school bag away. Anything that you notice in the day that really tells that child explicitly that you appreciate them and that you're noticing the things that they're doing. And part of that is also giving age and stage appropriate independence. So allowing a bit of trust, allowing them to make choices where that's appropriate and to try things out for themselves. I think we can often get into a pattern of feeling like we need to give lots and lots of support, and sometimes that's very, very appropriate, but there are sometimes bits within that that the child or young person can take on for themselves and do together with you, which gives the added benefit of some connection time as well. And it's about accepting feelings without judgment or trying to fix necessarily, but hearing and containing and co-regulating if necessary. So the other key area that I wanted to cover today is supporting positive relationships. So as I said, the relationships that young people and children have with the significant people in their lives are very important to their well-being throughout all of childhood and adolescence. So we'll talk a little bit about connection and what that means, limits and boundaries that help young people feel safe and that things are predictable, and also just positive peer relationships, and so how they understand their place in the world around them. So, as I've already said, particularly in early stages of development, but throughout childhood and adolescence, a safe and predictable and nurturing relationship is absolutely essential for children's well-being. It's how they learn how to regulate their feelings and their behaviour, and how to understand themselves, and also to understand the difference between them and other people. And that relationship is what sets the foundation for them interacting with a wider group of people, so their peers or other trusted adults around them. And this is just a nice visual representation from the Circle of Security model. So this is a parenting organisation and model about attachment relationships and how caregivers develop a sense of safety and ability to organise feelings in children and young people. So it's talking about the parent or carer being that secure base, that safe haven for the young person to come back to again and again. And so what we need is the parent or caregiver to support that young person to explore their environment and to make some choices, but to watch over them while they're doing that, and to show delight in them, to share enjoyment, and to welcome them back at times where they feel uncomfortable. So it's about protection, it's about comfort, it's about helping that young person to organise their feelings and understand them. So when we think about connection, connection can be just the presence of you as a safe adult, but it's about unconditional love, or if you're in a professional setting, unconditional regard and respect for that child, and care and kindness. So what we need for adults around children to be is always bigger, stronger, wiser and kind. And most of the time is good enough, because sometimes that doesn't always happen because people are under their own pressures or they're triggered and their own emotions come to the forefront. But for most of the time, if we're tuned into child's emotions and their behaviour and responsive to their cues, it will help them to develop that sense of safety and begin to organise their own feelings. So good enough, and most of the time, is what we're looking for. It's something that a lot of parents and caregivers of children with neurodevelopmental conditions are very good at, because there are a lot of cues sometimes that come from children have a high level of need. And that need for connection with others really increases at times where children are uncomfortable or uncertain. What we need to think about as well is using that connection before we try and do any problem solving or correction. So as I said before, when a child is highly distressed, their brain has gone into its alarm, fight or flight system, and the thinking and problem solving part of their brain has shut down. So we must connect with them and help them to calm first before we start thinking about solutions. So in terms of thinking about connection, every child is obviously going to be unique. So have a think about what that child likes to do, who they like to spend time with, the kinds of activities that they enjoy. Think about when the best times of the day to do a bit of connection are, because it happens naturally most days anyway, but there may be particular times where you decide that it would be important to really make an effort to add in extra moments for connection. So some ideas would be physical activities together. So they can be anything that your child enjoys or that's practical for your family or your setting. It might just be, like I said before, being present with them. So watching a TV show with them, reading together, looking at photos of happy memories together. Sometimes young people find it easier to talk as they walk or to share things with you while they're on a car journey. Daily routines are fantastic for connection because you can do these together. Sometimes when we're busy, we're just all rushing around and we're not really taking the time to connect with the people around us, but we can do that as part of our daily routine. Bedtime is a fantastic time to have really structured and routine connection together. You can have a calm space for your child and, you know, spend time quietly together there or lie down with them quietly. Copying or back and forth games are really good. So Simon Says is a good way of building in some progressive muscle relaxation for young people that would find it difficult to do more structured exercises. So copying big movements, copying relaxation. And I suppose it's important to just highlight that it's absolutely normal, as I said, for relationships to have times of difficulty and for that connection to become difficult at times. But as long as that's repaired, that's okay. We're just looking for most of the time being tuned in and being connected to your child. Sometimes children and young people will also reject connection and nurture if they're feeling very distressed. And so we can think then about strategies we can use from a distance. So putting a note in their bag or in their lunch, holding them in mind by giving them something preferred that helps them to realise that connection with you, that that's something that you know and they know that they enjoy. It can be an object like a photo keyring, or it can be a toy or a small item, a sensory item. And the love button idea is having a bracelet or a drawing on your child's hand or wrist, and the same for you, and the child can touch that or press on it during the day when they want to feel connected to you, which is really good for children who struggle with separation. So a little bit just about limits and boundaries for safety as well. So as I said before, young people and children feel safest when they have appropriate boundaries and limits set by the adults around them. So where they need supervision and prevention of things escalating, have a think about that for your family or for your setting. Think about your routines and your rules at home. Are they always clear and consistent, or do they sometimes change depending on what's happening? It's really important to make sure that all instructions and requests are just short and simple. And you can involve children, if appropriate, in what they think should be rules for ending screen time, for example, or any sort of boundaries and limits that you want to have that are appropriate for your own setting or home. If they can be, it's nice to involve them in that so that they understand the purpose of them. And if they are testing limits and boundaries, have a think about why, what need is that meeting? Peer relationships can be very tricky and a source of distress. So when we're thinking about positive peer relationships, we have to be respectful of that child and their own needs and preferences, and supporting them to make their own choices about what's a preferred social activity. We just want them to be able to be themselves. They may have different interests in comparison to peers their own age, but it's really important for them to be able to pursue those and feel that those are something that they're allowed to do. They might be very highly motivated to make friends, but find this very stressful. So we can think about ways to support them with that. And that may be particular coping skills, so that they don't have to mask or avoid social situations and become overwhelmed. It might be having shorter bursts of social contact. It might be online instead of face-to-face. It might be one-to-one instead of in a group. It might be that they need lots of breaks when they're in social settings. And we also need to think about the preferred environment for engaging socially. It may be that outside is better than inside, and they may prefer to do things alongside other people instead of with them. So it's very individual to each child, but it's just an important area to think about if it's causing them distress. So the final area that I wanted to cover was just thinking about supporting behavioural challenges. So we need to think about the environment. We all like to have environments that are nice and work well for us. That makes us much more able to regulate our feelings and our behaviour and our thinking. We'll talk a little bit about communication and also about learning and developing skills. So when we think about healthy environments, the environment can sometimes be very easy to control, but other times there are aspects of the environment that cause a huge amount of stress and they can't always be changed. So we have to think about how can we make those adjustments good enough that they're supporting that young person to meet their potential and feel as calm and secure as they can. It's really important to think, first of all, if there are significant difficulties with sleep or health difficulties, issues with eating and drinking, and high level of sensory needs that need to be addressed, that would be the place to start, because these are the things that have a huge impact on behaviour. We want to make sure that routines and predictability are in place, try and organise things so that there are opportunities for choice as well. As I've said before, we need to have appropriate boundaries and limits so that young people know what's expected of them. And we can think as well about prevention in the environment. So are there known triggers for our young people that will cause them distress? And is there a way to adjust that and to prevent that from happening? Where possible, we're always trying to think about managing difficulties rather than avoiding, because if we do avoid a situation or a particular context, it does increase anxiety the majority of the time and also decreases your confidence as a parent or a caregiver and the child's confidence to manage that. So if possible, by breaking it down, it's better to try and think about how can this situation or environment be more manageable? Is there a way that we can continue to do this, but with adjustments that make it easier for my child to manage? We know that change and transitions can be a huge trigger for strong emotion. So again, it's just trying to think about, are there any small adjustments that can be made that will make that easier for the child or the young person? And we need to think about plenty of opportunities for activity, whether that's fun and play or whether that's physical exercise and movement, or it could be sensory-based needs that need to be addressed in the environment as well. Communication is a very important factor when we're thinking about behavioural challenges, and behaviour is always itself a communication. So if you notice that there are behaviours happening a predictable pattern, it's really important to try and consider what the need is underneath that behaviour. So it may just be an expression of overwhelm and a build-up of very strong emotions, and then you're tracking back and thinking about how can I add in skills that will try and reduce that. Are there any preventative changes that I can make to the environment or routines that I can put in place? Sometimes behaviour is testing out boundaries just to see what's expected, or it may be to gain something that the child wants or needs. It might be to stop something that they don't want. It might be when they have a particular expectation in their mind and that isn't met. And that can be to do with misunderstandings and communication. And they may just lack alternative ways of expressing themselves or managing those strong feelings. And that's particularly the case if language is a difficulty for the child or young person. So if we think about some of the challenges to communication, it may be that the child can understand more than they can express. Sometimes understanding is also overestimated because young people might appear to agree with what's being said or say certain things that make it seem like they understand, but actually when you unpick that, they don't fully understand what's being asked of them. So it's almost always helpful to reduce language for everyone because we all get overwhelmed by language, and to use simple sentences and non-verbal supports where that's indicated. It's really, really helpful to use examples and to show young people instead of telling them what you would like them to do. It's a normal process of development to watch those around you and start to learn how to behave by observing that. When we're working with or supporting or parenting children with neurodevelopmental conditions, sometimes we have to be much more explicit about the teaching of that. It's not as easy for them to just monitor what's going on and copy and assimilate that knowledge. It has to be taught to them explicitly sometimes. So using examples, using stories, using play, being very, very specific and showing instead of telling is almost always helpful. Just be aware as well of time concepts being tricky if that's an issue for your child or young person, and think about how you might support that as well. So whether you have a now and next system or whether you have visual supports or a calendar or a diary, anything that helps children to understand and support the waiting process can really reduce behavioural challenges. It's really important as well to give young people time to respond because a lot of children with neurodevelopmental conditions take longer to process information, especially if it's verbal information. They also have to realise that you're talking to them, which might not happen if you're in a busy environment and you're trying to manage lots of different things at the same time. Sometimes when we speak as well, we don't really say exactly what we mean, or we might say things in a different order to what we actually want to happen. So either only giving one instruction at a time or saying things very clearly in the order that they should happen is really helpful. And also really helpful to always make endings very clear, either with a word finished or a symbol or a sign or a visual, anything that helps your child to understand this is finished now. And similarly to showing instead of telling, if you tell the child what to do and not what not to do, that is really helpful, because it can be very confusing when we speak in negatives, and it's just something that we naturally do. And if it's hard for your child to tell you something, ask them to show you and see if they can do it that way instead. So another key part of supporting behaviour is to really have a think about where your child is developmentally and what skills they are still developing and what would be appropriate for them to learn that would help them to manage things a bit better. So that can be broad life skills or it can be specific coping skills. But as I said before, we sometimes have to be very, very clear and explicit on teaching those, and we can't expect always that they'll just be picked up by observing. So it's always really important to work with the child where they are and start from that point of view. Think about what their interests are, think about what their motivations are, and working together in that sort of connecting way can really help. So modeling what you're doing things with can be really helpful to try and build those skills in. And sometimes there needs to be lots of repetition to reinforce the skills. You might also, it's very normal in development to have a child who can do things sometimes, but not consistently. And that might go on for a long period of time where it seems like they've lost a skill or they're just not acquiring it, but it's just the consolidation of that skill can take a long time. And it may be there are some times where they can do it really well and other times where they just can't access that capability. You can do scaffolding type approaches. So you can think about, you start the activity and the child does the last part of it, or the child can start the activity or the task and you can complete it. And that can just be really helpful for building confidence and self-esteem as well. If children are able to do things that are developmentally appropriate, it gives them a sense of confidence and self-esteem as well. So with that in mind, I just wanted to think a little bit about when you might need some more support. So these are all of the things that we can think about for maintaining well-being and good mental health. But sometimes you might find that the child that you're working with, or your child, if you're a parent, is really not responding to a lot of the things that you're trying, and they just have persistent difficulties with their emotions across different settings. There's a really significant disruption to your family life. If a child or young person is having really intense and frequent behavioural meltdowns, or they're withdrawing and shutting down, then that's a sign that you need extra support. They might have new or increased difficulties with their sleep or with their appetite. A lot of the time when children are very anxious and very unsettled, what we see is a really increased need for control. So they suddenly want to control everything around them. And that's understandable because that helps them to feel safe, but it can become very, very challenging. And avoidance is part of that control as well. So being unable to take part in their usual routines or even enjoyed or preferred activities. They might also present with more difficulties coping with what you would see as minor frustrations or pressures that they may be used to be able to cope with. Sometimes what we see as well is an increased need for reassurance all the time. So asking all the time or needing to be close to a safe adult all of the time and not being able to explore and, progress and engage in the environment around them. You might see an increase in repetitive behaviours as well. And of course, if there's any self-injury or suicidal thoughts, then that's a cause for concern and something that you need to ask for more support with. But the key thing is that everyone knows their own child best. People working with children know them best, and it's really important to just raise those concerns if they're there. So finally, I just wanted to speak a little bit about caring for yourself as a parent or a caregiver, because as I've talked about, there are a range of different challenges that can happen over time, and some points of development or transition are very intense and are much more likely to have a big impact on emotional well-being and behaviour and relationships. So I think noticing what works for you and what helps you to cope can be a really useful thing to do. It's not always easy to do if you're feeling like you're overwhelmed yourself, but just taking that time to think about what does help me, when have I coped best, what can I put in place that will take some of the pressure off, because those pressures on you as a caregiver or a parent do have an impact on your ability to respond and take part in these co-regulation, connection type activities with your child. So give yourself time to notice your own feelings and thoughts and time to reflect on them. And I think just really importantly, show yourself self-care and compassion and kindness, because it's very difficult to show compassion and kindness and care to others if we're feeling critical of ourselves. make a plan. So have a think about, where am I now and where would I like to be? What small changes could I make that will help me to feel a bit more in control of this, or that I'm making progress? And obviously ask for help as and when you need it. So that can be from the professional network supporting your child, or it can be from your own support network, so your own family, friends, and obviously there are organisations that are very supportive for parents as well. So have a think about, do I need a bit of extra support? Am I trying to manage too much by myself? Because being in a good place and feeling like you've got the resources makes it much easier to support your child's well-being. So I've just highlighted a couple of useful resources based on what I've spoken about today. So Parent Club Scotland is a really useful website. There's lots of different activities and things that you can access, and information about some of the concepts that we've talked about today. And the Solihull Approach to Parenting also have a really good series of online courses for parents, and you can access them for free. I'm pretty sure, with the code Tartan, but you can find that from the Parent Club website. CAMHS Resources is a website that has lots of different mental health resources, and access to different guides and strategies. Hands on Scotland is a Fife-based website that also has a similar structure. And Young Minds is very useful, particularly for teenagers, but also for children of any age and for parents, for information about mental health and some ideas and strategies. Okay, so that's